Join me as I dive into the story of a bank manager's shocking mistake and see if I can uncover the truth behind this controversy. The sun was beating down on the small but bustling city of Montgomery, Alabama. Inside the marble-clad halls of Haven Trust Bank, a mixture of hushed conversations and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards filled the air. The morning rush was winding down, and most of the employees were settling into their usual routines. Amid the backdrop of polished professionalism, a man stepped through the tall glass doors. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence. He wore a crisp navy suit, its tailored fit hinting at someone who valued presentation but didn't flaunt it. His name was Malcolm Avery, a name known to very few in the building, though it soon would be etched into their memories forever. Malcolm walked to the nearest customer service desk, greeted the clerk with a polite smile, and asked to make a simple transaction. But before the clerk could assist, a firm voice interjected from across the room. "Excuse me, I'll handle this," barked the bank manager, man named Gordon Brewer. Gordon's tone wasn't friendly. It carried an edge, as though Malcolm's mere presence disrupted the bank's flow. Gordon was known among his staff for his rigid demeanor. His self-imposed title as the bank's gatekeeper meant he relished moments where he could exercise authority, especially when his biases went unchecked. He approached Malcolm with a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sir Gordon began glancing Malcolm up and down, in a way that betrayed his assumptions. "We have certain policies here. I'll need to see proper identification." Before proceeding, Malcolm's expression didn't waver. Calmly, he slid his ID across the counter and waited. Gordon picked it up, inspecting it longer than necessary, his face growing visibly skeptical. "What is the purpose of your visit today?" Gordon asked, his tone sharper now, as though Malcolm's presence demanded extra scrutiny. "I'd like to withdraw from my account," Malcolm said, his voice steady but firm. Gordon glanced at the ID again, then at Malcolm. "I'm sorry, but we can't process this without further verification. You understand? It's just policy." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Policy or something else?" The room grew quieter. A few employees and customers nearby began to take notice, their stolen glances filled with curiosity and unease. Malcolm stood his ground, saying nothing further, waiting for Gordon to clarify. Gordon cleared his throat, his voice rising as though he wanted to make a point. "If you don't have additional verification, I suggest you return when you do." "I see," Malcolm said, his voice calm yet heavy with meaning. "You're refusing to serve me then?" "I didn't say that," Gordon shot back quickly, his face flushing. "But we take fraud very seriously here, sir. I'm sure you understand." Malcolm held Gordon's gaze for a moment longer, then gave a faint nod. "I do understand more than you realize." The tension in the room was palpable, but Malcolm didn't raise his voice, nor did he appear flustered. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a black phone. With a few taps, he placed a call. His voice, low but direct. "Yes, this is Malcolm. Could you send someone down to Haven Trust Bank? It seems there's been a misunderstanding." As he hung up, Malcolm turned back to Gordon, who now looked more confused than confident. "Let's wait a moment," Malcolm said, with a faint, enigmatic smile. The minutes that followed felt longer than they were. Eyes darted nervously across the room, while Gordon fidgeted behind the counter, unsure of what to say next. Malcolm stood calmly, hands clasped in front of him, as though the entire scene were unfolding just as he had expected. The silence in the bank was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers or a forced cough Customers shifted uneasily, some pretending not to notice the tension, while others openly stared. Gordon, trying to reclaim a sense of control, folded his arms and leaned over the counter. "You can't expect special treatment, sir," Gordon said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Rules are rules." Malcolm met his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking for special treatment, just the same treatment as anyone else." This quiet assertion seemed to irritate Gordon further. "You people always think." He caught himself mid-sentence, his face reddening. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "You people," he repeated, his voice steady but cutting. Gordon stammered, suddenly aware that others were listening. "I meant customers who don't follow proper procedures." By now, even the clerks behind their desks had stopped working, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene. One of them, a young woman named Erin, whispered to her colleague, "Do you think he'll call the police?" The colleague shrugged nervously, whispering back, "Gordon loves throwing his weight around, but this guy doesn't seem fazed." Meanwhile, Gordon had taken out a clipboard, pretending to check some documents. It was a futile attempt to look busy, as though the confrontation wasn't worth his full attention. "If you can't provide additional proof of your account, I'll have to ask you to leave," he said firmly. Malcolm smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're quite confident in your judgment, Mr. Brewer." Gordon bristled. "That's my job, ensuring this bank operates with integrity." Integrity. Malcolm repeated the word heavy with irony. He turned slightly, addressing the room. "Is this how Haven Trust Bank defines integrity? By denying service based on assumptions?" Gordon's face hardened. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave if you continue disrupting business." At that moment, the glass doors of the bank swung with open, a quiet hiss, and a tall man in a gray suit walked in. His stride was purposeful, his presence commanding. Heads turned as he approached the counter where Malcolm stood. "Mr. Avery," the newcomer greeted Malcolm, his voice filled with deference. "I came as quickly as I could." The room froze. Gordon blinked, looking between Malcolm and the newcomer. "Mr. Avery?" he echoed, his tone uncertain. "Yes, Mr. Brewer," the man in the gray suit said, turning to face Gordon. "Malcolm Avery, the principal owner of Haven Trust Bank." The words hit like a thunderclap. Gordon's face drained of color as his clipboard slipped from his hands and clattered onto the counter. You own the bank," Gordon stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm turned to him, his expression calm but unyielding. "That's correct. And yet here I am, being refused service by the very people I've entrusted to uphold the values of this institution." A murmur rippled through the room. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, while customers whispered among themselves. The young clerk, Erin, covered her mouth, trying to suppress a gasp. Gordon opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a man grasping at straws, trying to piece together an explanation. Malcolm didn't wait for him to recover. "You see, Mr. Brewer, I came here today to observe, to understand the experience of our customers firsthand. What I didn't expect was a demonstration of bias and disrespect from someone in your position." The man in the gray suit cleared his throat. "Mr. Avery, would you like to discuss this in the boardroom, or shall we address it here?" Malcolm glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of the employees and customers who had borne witness to the scene. "No," he said firmly. "We'll address it here. Everyone should hear this." Gordon swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the counter. The atmosphere in the bank shifted as the realization of Malcolm's identity began to sink in. Gordon's confidence had crumbled, replaced by visible anxiety. He opened and closed his mouth, like a man searching for an escape route, but there was none. Malcolm's voice broke the heavy silence. "Mr. Brewer, as the manager of this branch, you represent the face of this bank. To every person who walks through these doors, your actions today tell me something troubling about what this institution might truly stand for, or at least what you stand for." Gordon tried to recover. I assure you, sir, this was a misunderstanding. We have strict policies to prevent fraud, and I was only Stop. Malcolm's voice was calm, but it silenced the room instantly. He took a step closer, placing his hands lightly on the counter. This wasn't about fraud prevention. This was about your assumptions. You saw me walk in, decided I didn't belong, and acted accordingly. Let's not sugarcoat it. Gordon's cheeks flushed, and he looked down at the counter. Malcolm continued, his tone measured but piercing. You didn't bother to ask questions, didn't look up my account details. Instead, you made a judgment based on nothing, what you thought you knew, and you were wrong. The staff stood frozen, their eyes darting nervously between Malcolm and Gordon. The customers whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement with Malcolm's words. Mr. Avery, the man in the gray suit, interjected cautiously, perhaps we should take this opportunity to review our training and policies across all branches. Absolutely. Malcolm agreed without looking away from Gordon. But first, I'd like to hear from Mr. Brewer. I want to know why he felt justified in treating a customer this way. Gordon's mouth was dry, and his voice cracked when he finally spoke. Sir, I've always tried to maintain high standards here. I didn't mean. You didn't mean, Malcolm interrupted, his voice rising just enough to command attention. You didn't mean to deny me the same service you'd offer to anyone else. Or you didn't mean to let your bias guide your actions. Gordon's shoulders slumped, and his gaze dropped to the floor. I made a mistake, he mumbled. A mistake, Malcolm echoed, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. He let the word linger in the air for a moment. And what do you think happens to the people on the receiving end of those mistakes? Do you think they just forget it and move on? Or do you think they carry it with them? One more reminder that they're seen as less than others. Gordon didn't respond. He looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Malcolm straightened, turning to address the room. To everyone here, employees, customers, I want you to know that this bank is supposed to represent opportunity, fairness, and respect for all. If any of you have ever felt otherwise, I want to hear about it. This stops today. The man in the gray suit nodded solemnly. We'll issue a formal review of this branch and its leadership, Mr. Avery, effective immediately. Gordon looked up, panic flashing across his face. Please. Sir, I've worked here for 15 years. 15 years, Malcolm said, his voice soft but cutting. And what have you learned in that time? Mr. Brewer, that power comes from belittling others. That respect is conditional. The words struck like a hammer, and Gordon had no response. Malcolm glanced at the man in the gray suit. Make sure the review is thorough. I want accountability, not excuses. Yes, sir, the man replied. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Malcolm. His calm authority, his refusal to let anger dictate his actions, had captivated everyone. He turned back to Gordon, his voice softer now. This isn't just about you, Mr. Brewer. This is about the culture we allow to thrive. Change starts at the top, and today, it starts with Gordon stood there, his confidence utterly shattered. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a crushing tide. Malcolm's words weren't loud or angry, but they were searing, leaving no room for justification. Gordon's usual air of authority had dissolved, replaced by a pale, trembling man who looked as though he were begging for a reprieve. Malcolm let the silence hang for a moment before addressing Gordon again. Tell me, Mr. Brewer, if the roles were reversed and you walked into one of my banks only to be dismissed, scrutinized, and treated with contempt, how would you feel? Gordon swallowed hard, his throat dry. I would feel humiliated, he admitted, barely above a whisper. Exactly, Malcolm replied, his tone unwavering, and that humiliation is something too many people face every day, because of individuals like you who let their personal biases dictate their actions. What you did wasn't just wrong. It was emblematic of a deeper problem, one this institution can no longer afford to ignore. Around the room, staff and customers alike watched with rapt attention. Some nodded quietly, their expressions a mix of agreement and discomfort. Erin, the young clerk who had witnessed the entire incident, found herself reflecting on her own behavior. She couldn't remember doing anything like what Gordon had done. But now she wondered if she had ever unconsciously treated someone differently, even without realizing it. Gordon, struggling to maintain what little dignity he had left, took a deep breath. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." "Apologies are a start," Malcolm said, "but actions speak louder than words. What will you do to ensure this never happens again? Not just here, but anywhere you work in the future?" Gordon hesitated, his face a mixture of shame and confusion. I don't know. I've never thought about it like this before." "That's the problem," Malcolm said. "You've never had to think about it, but now you do. And if you're serious about making things right, you'll start by educating yourself and others. Bias doesn't just disappear because you're sorry. It takes deliberate effort to unlearn it." The room was silent as Malcolm turned to the man in the gray suit. "Mr. Daniels, I want mandatory sensitivity and bias training implemented across all branches, and I want a dedicated channel for customers and employees to report incidents like this. No one should ever feel dismissed or discriminated against in one of my banks." Daniels nodded firmly. "Consider it done, Mr. Avery." Malcolm looked back at Gordon one last time. "You're suspended pending review. Whether or not you have a future here will depend on your willingness to confront the prejudices you've allowed to shape your behavior." Gordon's shoulders slumped. He knew there was no arguing, no way to undo what had been done. "I understand," he said quietly. As Gordon stepped away from the counter, the room seemed to breathe again. Customers whispered amongst themselves, while employees exchanged glances that ranged from admiration to discomfort. Malcolm addressed the room. "To anyone who has ever been treated unfairly, whether it was here or elsewhere, I want you to know you have the right to be respected. Always. And to those who work here, remember, every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity. It's not just policy, it's human decency." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. Malcolm turned to Erin, the young clerk, and smiled faintly. "Do you have any questions for me?" Erin shook her head quickly, then hesitated. "Actually, sir, just one. How do you stay so calm in situations like this?" Malcolm chuckled softly. "Years of experience, and knowing that anger rarely changes minds, but actions and accountability do." The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of respect for the man who had stood his ground with grace and integrity. As the tension in the bank gave way to quiet murmurs, Malcolm took a deep breath, his composure unwavering. He stepped toward the center of the room, ensuring everyone could hear his next words. "What happened here today is bigger than a single incident," Malcolm began, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "It's a reflection of how easy it is for biases to creep into our actions unchecked, unnoticed until they hurt someone. And make no mistake, they do hurt." His gaze swept across the room, lingering on each face for a moment. "We live in a world where people are often judged not by their character, but by shallow assumptions. It's not just unfair, it's dangerous. It limits opportunities, it breeds division, and it diminishes the very thing that makes us human. Our ability to connect and understand one another." Malcolm turned to the man in the gray suit, Daniels, who was listening intently. "I want every branch of Haven Trust to embody the values we claim to stand for: respect, fairness, and opportunity. Starting today, we'll set the standard, not just for ourselves, but for others in this industry." Daniels nodded. "Understood, Mr. Avery. We'll implement the changes immediately." As Daniel spoke, one of the customers, a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse, stepped forward. Her voice was hesitant but firm. "I just want to say thank you for standing up and speaking out. It means a lot, especially to people who've been in similar situations." Malcolm gave her a warm smile. "Thank you for saying that. Change starts with conversations like this one." He turned back to Gordon, who was standing quietly by the side, looking more humble than ever before. "Mr. Brewer," Malcolm said, his tone softer. You made a serious mistake today. But mistakes, as painful as they are, can also be opportunities to grow. I hope you'll use this moment to reflect and do better. Not just for your sake, but for everyone who might cross your path in the future. Gordon looked down, nodding slowly. I will, sir. I promise. Satisfied, Malcolm addressed the room one final time. To everyone here, remember this moment. Let it remind you to treat each person you meet with respect, because in the end, that's what truly matters. Not wealth, not titles, not appearances, but how we treat one another. With that, Malcolm picked up his briefcase and turned toward the doors. As he walked out, the room remained silent, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Outside, the city bustled on, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. But inside the bank, something had shifted. Employees looked at one another with a newfound awareness. Customers whispered among themselves about the remarkable man who had just left. And Gordon, still standing near the counter, began to grapple with the reality of his actions. The moral of the story was clear. Power doesn't come from authority or status. It comes from character, from the strength to lead with dignity and fairness, even in the face of bias and adversity. Malcolm had reminded them all of that truth, leaving an indelible mark, not just on the bank, but on every person in that room. The events of the day rippled beyond the walls of Haven Trust Bank. Word spread quickly among employees and customers alike, and by the next morning, Malcolm's actions had become the subject of countless conversations. At headquarters, Daniels had already begun implementing the changes Malcolm had mandated. Bias training programs were being scheduled. New reporting channels were in development, and a renewed mission statement was being drafted, one that reflected the very values Malcolm had articulated so powerfully. For Gordon Brewer, the day had been a reckoning. Suspended from his role, he found himself reflecting deeply on the choices that had led him. He spent hours replaying the interaction in his mind, each word from Malcolm cutting deeper than the last. But amidst the shame and regret, there was a glimmer of determination. For the first time, Gordon resolved to confront the prejudices he'd long ignored, vowing to rebuild himself as a better person. Aaron, the young clerk, took Malcolm's words to heart. Inspired by his grace and strength, she began speaking up in meetings, advocating for more inclusive practices within her branch. She realized that change wasn't just about policies. It was about people stepping up one action at a time. And Malcolm, he returned to his office that evening, not with triumph, but with quiet resolve. He knew the fight against discrimination was far from over. One bank branch was just a small part of a much larger picture. But as he looked out over the city, from his office window, he allowed himself a moment of hope. Change might be slow, but every step mattered. As the camera fades to black, as Malcolm walked out, a message pinged on his phone. You missed. His smile faded, the weight of what lay ahead settling in. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful moments.